It's fantastic to have so many mighty NTEU members here, but in particular, I'd like to welcome those of you who are less familiar with our union. We hope you enjoy today's session and get a lot out of it. We've had an overwhelming response to today's meeting. As I said, just under 2,000 registered. So thanks to all of you who submitted questions in advance. We're going to try and get through all of those questions. And if we have some time, which I don't think we will at the end, we're going to open it up for additional questions. But if your questions don't get answered, if we don't have time to get to them, please contact us on whs@nteu.org.au. That's whs@nteu.org.au. As you all know, Omicron continues to pose health and safety risks to workers across the country. Today, we're going to be joined by Gabe Gooding, NTEU National Assistant Secretary, and Dom Rowe, who's our Director of Campaigning and Organising. Gabe and Dom are going to share with you the NTEU's plans for securing adequate protections for all staff and students, and our position on how employers can prioritise the health and safety of university workers. In addition to today's session, next Friday, also at 2 o'clock, we're going to run a follow-up session for those of you who are thinking about becoming a health and safety representative. You don't have to just be thinking about becoming a health and safety representative. If you're interested, I suppose, in the role and vital function that HSRs play in the workplace, please feel free to come along. We'll send you an email early next week, so please register if you're interested. So given, I suppose, the amount of questions we have and the amount we need to get through, without any further ado, I'm going to pass to Gabe Gooding.
Thanks, Sally. And welcome, everybody. It is a fantastic turnout, and a particular welcome to any HSRs that we have online today. You play such an important role in maintaining health and safety workplaces, and I think it's really important that we all recognise the work that you do. I'm going to try to share my screen with you. Right, so that's the title. So that's what we're talking today about, is returning to campus safely. This session has two parts. The first part that I'll be doing, which is largely about rights and responsibilities. So your employer's responsibilities and your rights, what they can and can't do. And Dom is going to be going through what you can do in your workplace to make sure that it's safe and healthy. Things we won't be talking about today because they don't go to those questions of rights and responsibilities about views about vaccines or personal freedoms or the relative severity of Omicron variant. So we won't be going to those today. We'll just be looking strictly at your rights, what you can do and what your employer has to do in order to make sure that return to campus is safe for you. So there are basically two lots of laws at the moment in the context of returning to campus in the COVID environment during a pandemic that regulate your health and safety. The first is the public health orders, and they're basically the minimum we comply with, and they take into considerations a wider breadth of issues than the WHS laws. So we have seen the impact of the effect of community public health orders on the economics and the business of the community being taken into consideration, and the balancing of those things that occurs in public health orders. In WHS laws, it's not like that. It's entirely focused on the health and safety of you at your particular work site, and it doesn't consider the economic impact of any mitigations against health and safety risks. So while we're covered by two laws, the employers basically have responsibilities under two separate schemes, not counting, of course, the public health orders. So under the enterprise agreement, they have to consult you on changes to work. And in most agreements, there'll be a set process for them doing that. And they have to follow all the agreement processes. And we'll come to that a little bit later when we're talking about what happens when instructions are issued and employees don't follow those instructions. Under the WHS laws, they have a much longer list of responsibilities, which are really quite specific, and there are much stronger enforcement possibilities. So we believe that the best way to tackle this issue at the moment is through the WHS laws. So their responsibilities basically go to, as far as is reasonably possible, to eliminate or reduce risks and hazards in the workplace. So one of the important things in this environment is that they have to monitor the health of the workforce. So we know there's a number of universities who are not collecting information about whether people have tested positive or become sick from COVID. We believe that that's an important function that they have to do. In fact, we don't believe it. It is a legislative function. And it's not something they routinely do, monitoring the health of their workforce. So I challenge anybody on this session today to show me any evidence of universities as a group systematically monitoring the mental health of their workforce in response to, for example, change managements or workload models. So it's something we really need to force them to start doing. They've got to identify hazards, and the things that we'll be talking about specifically today, the bottom two, consulting with HSRs and employees and taking all reasonably practicable measures. So we'll go into what are reasonably practicable measures that they must take. So you also have a responsibility, and that's not to make a hazard worse. Okay, so that's a fairly simple responsibility. Just don't make things worse. Don't exacerbate it. Don't come to work when you're sick. Don't come to work when you've tested positive. Those are things in this environment that will meet your responsibility not to contribute to it or to exacerbate it. And your rights really mirror your employer's responsibilities. And it would have been really good if I could have fixed that typo in there before I put it up. So what is a responsibility for them is a right for you. And again, it's their responsibility to consult you, and it's your right to be consulted. And in the work health and safety legislation, it's important to note that consultation is more rigorous than it is through the collective agreements, and they have to provide more information, and they have to do the consultation before the decision, and your input has to be incorporated into those decisions. So it's a much more rigorous consultation process. So let's talk about it a little bit. It's an absolute right. And the important thing is it must be conducted before they have made the decision. Okay, so if they've decided to go back to campus and they haven't consulted on the work health and safety aspects of that, then they are in breach of the work health and safety legislation. And when they consult you, they must include evidence of their risk assessment and how they're going to manage that risk. What are they going to do to make the workplace safer and healthy enough for you to return to the workplace? So a lot of people ask, what can we do about it? Well, there's a number of things we can do about it, but I guess the most obvious is that a health and safety rep can issue a provisional improvement notice. A provisional improvement notice is actually a legal notice to the employer that the health and safety rep believes that the employer is in breach of the Health and Safety Act, and it gives the employer a certain number of days, whatever the HSR thinks is a reasonable number of days, to resolve the issue, and that process is overseen by the workplace regulator. Generally speaking, issuing a provisional improvement notice always prompts employer action. It's really the equivalent of a police officer issuing you a summons. So it is a very strong tool, and much stronger than the tools that we have in the Fair Work Act. So first of all, they have to consult you before they make a decision. Secondly, there has to be a risk assessment, and the key parts of a risk assessment in this environment are actually relatively simple. What's the hazard? Well, the hazard is contracting COVID at work. What's the risk of doing so? Well, in the Omicron environment with a high level of transmissibility, it's a very high risk of doing so. And I just put a little asterisk there because coming from Western Australia myself, I am always conscious of the differences between WA and the rest of the states. The risk may be lower in WA while there is less community transmission, but nevertheless the hazard is still there. When thinking about how that risk or that hazard is going to be controlled, then they have to consider the degree of harm that it could potentially impose on an employee. So we know, yes, COVID's a hazard, yes, the risk is high, and we know that the potential of harm is high, so that we know that people become sick, people get long COVID, and we really still don't know what the implications of that are, and sadly people die from it. So there is a high degree of harm. And then determination of the control measures flows from, if you like, that matrix of considerations. So high hazard, high risk, high harm means you have to apply all the reasonably practicable control measures that you can. So just a slight diversion into a bit of WHS speak. There is this thing called hierarchy of controls, and they go from the left to the right, from the most effective to the least effective. And employers are obliged to work through the hierarchy of controls, first starting with elimination and then ending up at PPE. So elimination is removing the hazard. And in this case, that the hazard is being at work. So there's a pretty obvious elimination strategy. Reduction is literally what it says, about reducing the risk while people are at work, and that might be substituting the types of work, isolating the individual from work or the hazard from the individual, and engineering controls, and they will be physical things to prevent the employee being exposed to the hazard. Administrative controls, of course, are also a reduction measure, but they're less effective than substitution, isolation, and engineering. So administrative controls might be issuing an order for people to maintain social distancing, for example. And PPE on their own are the least effective. And it's not to say that they shouldn't be applied, but they are less effective than the other things. And remembering that the employer is supposed to be implementing all reasonably practicable measures, then the ones to the left of PPE should also be being implemented. To just quickly run down on what that means in this environment, clearly elimination is remote work because you're eliminating the risk of contracting COVID at work, which is the risk. The reduction are things like ventilation purification, vaccines, rats. A lot of those are engineering controls and proper cleaning. Then the administrative ones, as I said, things like occupancy limits or directions to engage in hand washing, and at the very end, masks. So when we're looking at a high hazard, high risk, high impact, then we expect in a risk assessment and the control measures that are being applied, that there will be inclusion of things from the left-hand side of that chart. So I just want to make one more observation that I think is really important in the university environment, because the university managements are not used to being challenged on things like this. The decision on whether a measure is reasonably practicable excludes cost or their strategic business considerations. So in other words, a desire to have a vibrant campus is not a reason to pursue a reasonably practicable measure. The only way where cost comes in is where there's a lower impact on the employees. So you might not shut the business down if employees are going to only have it's only going to have a minor impact on employees. So universities have traditionally made their own strategic decisions about their marketing position, their strategic goals, all that sort of stuff, without any consideration of the work health and safety of the community, particularly the community of employees. And in this case, the desire to reopen campus is clearly a work health and safety issue, reopening campuses, and the fact that they want to do it is not a reason to not pursue a reasonably practicable measure. So these are the things that we say should be in a well-done risk assessment and the controls that they should be applying in this current environment. So obviously encouraging remote work or working from home. Keeping sick employees out of the workplace is about pandemic leave particularly. Sick employees or employees who've been exposed to the virus and could bring the virus into the workplace. So pandemic leave is about having paid leave when you've tested positive that keeps you paid until such time as you test negative when you can return to the workplace. And that should apply to ongoing staff, part-time staff, and casuals as well. It's really important that casuals understand that. So that's one of the things that we think should be in risk assessment and the control measures. The next is the group that we hear a bit about, and they're sometimes talking about vaccination and boosters and RAT programs, ventilation, filtration, cleaning. Now, I've seen a lot of things from universities that say they're doing those things, but they don't give any detail. So in the consultation process, they need to give detail. Who's going to administer the RAT program? Who's going to pay for the RATs? Where is the evidence that the ventilation is adequate in each building? Where is the evidence of the filtration and the plan that they have to apply those things to your workplaces? And what is the plan for increasing the cleaning? And one of the areas that's often overlooked is the AV equipment in teaching spaces, which can be a really high risk site for being exposed to COVID. So just saying you're going to improve the ventilation or we have improved the ventilation is not adequate. They need to demonstrate how. So coming down the list, heading down to the least effective, occupancy limits and rostering days at work, vacating open plan. What they do is leave the hazard in place. They just reduce your exposure to it, and that's why they're in the heading into the least effective. Just a note on open plan spaces. I've seen some communications from universities to members saying they'll limit the number of staff who can be in open plan workspaces, but they don't say anything about students. Clearly, there is no point limiting the number of people who are working in a workspace if we're allowing an unlimited number of students to enter. And so as a general observation, we would say that whatever applies to students, since they are also capable of bringing the virus into the workplace, is that it should apply to students as well. And of course, right down the end, N95 or P2 masks as the least effective of the measures, but often people go to protective equipment first, and it should actually be the last thing on the list. So if you see a risk assessment from your employer, you've done well. When you see it, when we have forced the employers to consult, then it should have at least those things in it as options for mitigating against the risk of contracting COVID. So this is a question that's come up a lot, and it's about what is it lawful for my employer to do? So firstly, there are things where an employer can issue an instruction that's lawful and reasonable. Okay, so reasonable may vary from individual to individual. So a vaccine mandate will be a lawful instruction. There's no doubt about that, but it may not be reasonable to issue a vaccine mandate to an individual who has had an allergic reaction to the vaccine in the past, but it will be a lawful instruction. RAT or mask mandates will be lawful instructions, and we would say that the RATs and the masks have to be supplied by the employers if they're going to mandate their use. And if you are unable to wear a mask for a medical reason, then you probably will need to provide proof of that. Proof of vaccination is interesting because you can't apply a vaccine mandate without proof of vaccination. So it will be a lawful and reasonable instruction to provide proof of vaccination where there's a vaccine mandate. Where there's not a vaccine mandate, it may also be a lawful and reasonable instruction because the employer needs to do it to monitor the health of the workplace and to assess the risk in the workplace. So our advice is that it's very likely to be a lawful and reasonable instruction. They can instruct you to record your presence in a location through a QR code, or to report when you've tested positive, physical distancing requirements, and if you have tested positive and are spending time at home but you are not unwell, in that case you are not unfit to work, then they can direct you to work from home. So those are the things that they can do. And the reason I've put them together is because we've had a lot of questions from people about what happens if I don't want to be vaccinated. Well, what is likely to happen if you refuse to comply with a lawful and reasonable instruction is that it will go into a misconduct process, which can ultimately lead to termination of your employment. So back earlier when I referred to the enterprise agreements and the importance of following the processes, if we get to this point where you're in a misconduct process and you've defied a lawful or reasonable instruction, just about all we're going to be able to do for you is to make sure that the process is followed. So this is a note that applies to COVID or to anything else. Never decide not to comply with an employer directive without checking up with us first, because it can lead to very rapid termination of your employment. So make sure that you remember that. It doesn't mean there aren't lawful things that you can do too. And one of those is to refuse to work if your workplace is unsafe. And we will cover that in a second too. So health and safety reps are incredibly important people in the health and safety system on our campuses. They have a very important role. They have very significant rights and powers under the Work Health and Safety Acts, and they also have very significant protections under the Work Health and Safety Acts. So some of the powers that a health and safety rep has is that once they are trained, to issue the provisional improvement notice, the legal notice I talked about before, but also to order that work ceases. And that's a really, very strong power that health and safety reps can exercise. The qualification on that is that they have to have been trained. So one of the issues we ran into at the University of Canberra in the last couple of weeks is that there were health and safety reps, but because they hadn't been trained, they were not able to issue PINs. There are ways around that, but just to let everybody know, you have to have done the training before you can exercise the powers. Health and safety reps are also strongly supported by the NTEU, and a lot of people don't know, and sometimes health and safety reps forget, they can ask for anyone they like to assist in the performance of their duties. So they can ask the union to assist them and to work with them in performing their duties. And that's basically another level of protection that health and safety reps have in the workforce. So Alison's talked about whether you're thinking of becoming one. The info session is next week. I'd just like to reiterate, if you even if you're not thinking of becoming a health and safety rep, it's really important to know who your health and safety rep is, what they do and what they can do for you. So if you're even remotely interested in those issues, then we'd strongly encourage you to come to the session next week so that you can know how the health and safety system around your workplace works. So I've left a slide off here. So this is how you can send questions through to us at whs@nteu.org.au. You can talk to your HSR, you can contact your local branch or delegate, or you can email me or phone me. So there were two more things that I wanted to talk to you about. I shouldn't have put that slide up first, but the two things that I wanted to talk to you about is, what is the general commitment by the employers to work health and safety in our sector? And the answer is very poor. They are, the fact that they have not engaged in any consultation on the return to campus indicates they're either unaware of their responsibilities or they're prepared to ignore them. And that's a really problematic situation to be in this environment, but it's also problematic generally when we're looking at your health and safety, particularly your mental health at work. So the big plug I would have here is one of the ways that we are going to be approaching health and safety and resolving some of these problems is through enterprise bargaining. So we have a number of claims that are linked to work health and safety, such as the right to work from home, the right to disconnect, workload claims, job insecurity. Those are all issues that are fundamentally grounded in work health and safety, and that's an area that the universities are just simply not paying enough attention to. So please get involved in your work health and safety in your bargaining campaign, particularly if you're interested in work health and safety, but just generally, because what we're trying to do in bargaining is to bargain for better workplaces, and that includes workplaces that are both safer and healthier. Now, I'll be coming back to answer the questions that have been sent in, but now I'm going to hand over to Dom, who's going to do the second part of the presentation.
All right, hello everyone. Hopefully you can see my slides up on the screen there. I just want to talk a little bit about what's really happening in the sector at the moment. And now all of you would be experiencing this day in and day out. But what we're seeing is actually some physical and mental distress amongst workers in the sector as they're wondering what's happening with COVID, and particularly being asked to return to work so quickly without consultation. It's causing a lot of uncertainty for people, and we know that because we're getting lots of questions from members about what to expect and what not to expect. We've got incomplete and confusing information that's coming out from various managements, and that's frustrating a lot of you on this call, and you're really looking for some clear information. And we know that these issues are actually affecting you at home and at work, so it's quite a complicated set of issues for you. And as Gabe's talked about, there's been a lack of safe action by employers. Might move to the next slide. But in good news, we've actually had a number of wins that have happened across the sector already, with workers coming together in their union to try and make a difference to health and safety around Omicron and COVID. And when we look at it, there's some pretty exciting stories. I might start with Macquarie. The plan was at Macquarie that casuals would have to access workers' compensation if they got sick from COVID and couldn't work. An absolutely ridiculous situation. Workers, if they can't work because of a work-caused risk, then they should be paid for that. And management decided that it wouldn't share any of its info on the ventilation it was putting in place, and it wouldn't give any information about working from home for particularly vulnerable staff. And so union members got together and used work health and safety powers to really get some significant changes at Macquarie University. Now, at the casual at Macquarie University, you'll get paid if you're sick from COVID, which is remarkable and also the way it should be, so that casuals aren't doubly impacted by COVID. Secondly, vulnerable workers get easy access to working from home, and that was something that management didn't want to give at the start. There's full ventilation review that's going to be shared with the union, and there's now regular consultation and consultation processes set up. And union members were able to win that in a pretty quick period of time. If we look at Flinders down to the south, basically the union members there managed to get the management to consult over mandatory vaccines. They got better timelines and safeguards for workers in that, and they got an extension on the deadline for some workers on the mandate. Finally, they also are now asking that students not be exempt, because as we know, there's a lot of students that interact with this sector, and they too need to be under some of the same rules that staff are under. At the University of South Australia, we asked for proper consultation and risk assessments on Omicron and return to work directions. And so far, University of South Australia have had two very well attended members meetings where members got together to talk about the issues and decide what their plan was. They're challenging the consultation process, and it looks like shortly they'll be introducing a provisional improvement notice. If we move to the next slide, because this is one of my favourite ones, I want to say well done to anyone from the University of Canberra. You did a fantastic campaign around COVID. Again, there you were told, workers were told there that they had to return to work. There wasn't any consultation about how that was to happen. And there were a number of members that were very frustrated by that and wanted to change that situation. So a members' meeting was held that was really well attended. Union members conducted a poll of the workforce to find out how they felt about the return to work measures. There was meetings with HR, and then finally a submission put into WorkSafe because the management were refusing to move. After that, we called the media and we did social media, and that was, you can see some of the results of that media up there. And the result was that now people can access working from home at the University of Canberra during this COVID crisis, and they don't have to return to work on campus. So there was great work done there by members at the University of Canberra. You might realise we've got a lot of rights under the law, which is great, but these rights need to be enforced in some way. And the people in the group that can do that is actually workers enforcing those rights. So we need to build pressure in the work health and safety system. As Gabe mentioned, managements here seem to either be ignoring or unaware of their obligations under work health and safety. And it's up to all of us to place that pressure upon them so that they understand what their rights and responsibilities are to the workforce. So there's a range of things that you can do as a worker, and you might choose one or many of these. The first is surveying workers in your work area and finding out how they feel about the return to work practices and the work health and safety around COVID. You can have large town hall meetings, and so that's large meetings like this one actually, where you get large numbers of members together to talk about what campaign they're going to run and how they're going to shift management. You can do it a little bit smaller, so looking at local workplace area meetings, so you might feel more comfortable just talking to your colleagues that you work with every day about the issues, maybe passing on some of this information you learned from this seminar today. There's petitions, and they actually have quite a big impact on management. They show how many of you actually support a particular issue. They make it clear to management that they can't sweep it under the rug because hundreds, thousands of workers in your workplace all want a safe work environment. So petitions work quite well. We find that emails work nicely in work health and safety campaigns, particularly direct to decision makers. It does clog their inboxes, it forces them to go through them, and it means that they are clear again that there's a huge amount of support for the campaign that you're running. It's a bit of an escalation, we call it, so it's a step up in terms of pushing the boss in the right direction. Finally, you can do simple things like have online protests, so with Zoom backgrounds when management holds their briefing sessions. And that's again so management can see that a number of you are aware of your rights and responsibilities under work health and safety law. And finally, you can become a health and safety representative. Now, others have talked about that, but really the powers that role has make it critical to the safe functioning of universities. The final thing I'd say is if you're interested in a better workplace and a safer workplace, and if you want that safe workplace, then it's important that you join together with other workers in your local area, in your university, and join the union. When it's more of us together, we can place more pressure upon management and upon politicians to ensure that this sector is the way it should be and not the slightly unsafe way it's being left today. And with that, I'll leave it there.
Thanks, Dom. So what we're going to do now is go to, we've had an enormous number of questions come in advance, so I'm not going to be able to mention everybody who sent them because they've come into a number of categories. So one is, why are you forcing us online and preventing face-to-face teaching? And the reciprocal of that is, why are you forcing us back to campus and not leaving us online? And the answer to that is that we understand that there are benefits from face-to-face teaching, pedagogical benefits. There are also benefits that you get from those casual conversations and collaborations that occur in the workplace. But we say you can only return to campus, and that can only occur when the workplace is safe and healthy. So we're not actually saying you have to be fully at work or that you have to be fully online. We're saying that wherever you're working, it needs to be safe and healthy. Second one really goes around the issue of open plan offices, ventilation, and those sort of considerations. So open plan offices we've addressed. We think open plan offices in an environment where a virus is airborne are inherently dangerous, and that they should have quite strict occupancy limits, and rostering, possibly rostering in and out of those areas, the occupancy limits to apply to visitors and to students as well. Ventilation, a lot of people are saying to us, well, we've been told that the way that we improve ventilation is to open our windows. Lots of you are working in buildings where you can't open your window. I'm working in an office with a very nice window, but I can't open it. So those things, they need to be pulled up on those things. But also, it's not adequate to say just open a window and assume that that's adequate ventilation for COVID purposes. So any instruction that says just open the window is not going to be good enough. If you have a working environment where there isn't a window and there's no ventilation, then that is going to be an unsafe work environment in this current climate. So I said before that you're entitled to information. So you are entitled to ask and to receive the information on what ventilation there is in your workplace and in your particular location, how that's being measured, how much CO2 monitoring has been done, how they've checked whether that ventilation is maintained over a working day or a particular period. You're also entitled to know whether filtration's been installed or not. So those are things that you should be demanding to see, and you should be talking to your HSR about. But remember, ultimately you have the right not to go to work if it's an unsafe environment. So make sure try and find out as much as you possibly can, and demand that your employer provides the information that you need to consider whether the workplace is safe or healthy. So there's also been a question about general rights to work from home, particularly for professional staff beyond this pandemic. Most collective agreements don't have a general right to work from home for professional staff, but it is a major enterprise bargaining claim that we're making. So again, it's a really good reason to get involved with enterprise bargaining, to make sure that professional staff have the flexibility to either work from home full-time or in some working from home arrangement. So just to recount a little story this morning, we were in a negotiation session, and the management, when we raised this question of working from home, and they said blanket, everybody has to be back on campus. And we said, well, what about those people professional staff who have no contact with students or teaching or direct research? Why do they have to be on campus? And the answer was they were needed on campus to make it look like the campus was vibrant. And also, if they didn't have the full community on site, then cafes would not be profitable. And our view on that is you don't have to put your body onto a campus in order to make it look fuller, and neither do you have to put your body onto a campus to make a cafe more profitable. So some of these responses from employers are just extreme and absurd. So general rights to work from home, the answer is you probably don't have any. You need to check your collective agreement, but get involved in the bargaining campaign and force management to understand that modes of working have changed, and that it's perfectly practical for people to work from home or remotely. The next question we have is about the provision of masks and whether the employer should pay them, how many you should get, and particularly whether students should also be supplied with masks, and also about the policing of mask and room occupancy rates. So if I bundle all those together, masks should be supplied by your employer. We agree that students should also be supplied with masks, and they should be sufficient masks that you can change them regularly. The policing of masks, as some universities have attempted to do, is not the responsibility of staff members. It's not your job to make sure that students are wearing their masks in your workspace. That's not your job. You're not the COVID marshals. You're not policing it. And while it might be in your interest to say to the students that you're working with, put your masks on, please, it's not your job, and it is the employer's job to make sure that those mask mandates are being adhered to, and that may be through something like literally establishing COVID marshals at teaching venues. But don't take the responsibility for it. And remember, if you're in a confined teaching space, it's probably got limited ventilation. It possibly hasn't had the AV equipment, microphones and so on cleaned. If there is a significant number of students in the audience without masks, you are within your rights to walk out of that venue and to cease work because it's not safe. When you do so, you should contact us and you should contact your health and safety rep to let them know that you've left what you consider to be an immediate and imminent risk to your health. And that's the standard for when you can cease work. It's when it's an immediate and imminent risk of ill health. The next set of questions is about people who have particular conditions that are likely to make them more susceptible to COVID or likely to produce more severe impact of COVID. So autoimmune disease, asthma, people undergoing cancer treatments, all of those things, and whether they have to comply with a directive to return from work. And our answer is that those things are going to be considered on an individual basis. But generally speaking, if you have higher risk factors for COVID, then you either require significantly higher mitigation measures to be in place, or you can't return to work. So we would say that if you're in that situation and you believe that returning for work to campus-based work is more dangerous for you than for other employees, you should immediately alert your supervisor and manager and say you can't return to work because it is an unsafe workplace, and you should talk to your HSR. And one of my jobs for next week is to put out some fact sheets on how you work through that process so that you can get your individual situation assessed. So a blanket, everybody has to come regardless of the risk, is not adequate and is not acceptable. And you shouldn't just accept that instruction without challenging it first. Okay, so that means writing to your supervisor and manager and saying, it's unhealthy, it's not safe for me, I can't return to work. So what arrangements are you going to put in place to make sure that I can work in a safe and healthy environment? And of course, if you don't get the right answer, then you're talking to us and you're talking to the HSR, and it's possible for the HSR to put a pin on that particular order that's been issued. So for those, that's just a general. We've also had a question about whether this constitutes discrimination on the basis of disability. And to be fair, we haven't turned our minds to that because the work health and safety laws are so powerful that we haven't seen the need to consider going down the discrimination on disability route. As I said, the work health and safety laws are powerful and they're quick, they're responsive, because not resolving these issues exposes people to harm. So that's one of the reasons why they're there. Quite a few people have asked us about supply chain issues for rats and masks, and how can we require the employers to be providing things that aren't available. And the answer to that is, we say that those are conditions of returning to campus. And if the supply chain issues are not yet resolved on rats and masks, so that you can be reasonably certain that your working environment is as safe as it currently can be, then you continue to work from home until they are available. The absence of the tools renders that control mechanism moot, I guess, but that also means that they can't make the workplace safe. So we would say if there are no rats and masks available, then you can't return to work on campus. And I think maybe one of the things we should point out is, and the University of Canberra experience has shown us, that just because they've made a decision to return to campus on a particular date doesn't mean that decision can't be changed. And if the date is coming up for you really rapidly, then getting on to us and getting organised and stopping this, getting this consultation process going before the date of return will be really important. So, you know, get on to it, people, but you can change their decision, and the work health and safety laws will help you do that. One other is the one that we'll go into a little bit more detail next Friday, and I encourage everybody to come along, and hopefully we'll have some HSRs along who can tell you what a great job it is to do. And I should mention that HSRs do their work in work time, and they need consideration in workload models and so on for the time they spend in it. And that's who can be a HSR. Do you need any particular skills? And the answer is no. Anybody can be a HSR. And we know that there are a number of universities that are saying that casuals can't be HSRs. That is completely incorrect. Casuals can be HSRs, and our view is that they have particular circumstances where there should be a designated work group for casuals, and that there should be a casual HSR. So if there are any casuals who are interested in being HSRs, don't feel like you can't be. You get 5 days training, and you get support from the union, so you don't need any other qualifications or interests. And the final one is, but probably a really important one, is if I get COVID, what happens to my teaching? If you're sick and you can't work and you're on sick leave, then you can't perform your teaching, and you should attempt to perform your teaching. And neither should you be required to catch it up when you come back, because remember, your workload model is allocating the total number of hours that you can work in a year. And if sick leave is taken out of that total number of hours. Okay, so if you're not available to be at work for 2 weeks, then you can't just do 2 weeks more workload in the year. Okay, so you don't have to catch it up unless there's space in your workload model, or there's a substitution of those 2 weeks of time with some other activity that's in your workload, for example, work in the next semester. Similarly, if you're fully allocated, then you don't have to pick up the teaching of other people who are sick, because remember, these things also have work health and safety impacts on you, and one of those is the extreme mental health impact of excessive work. So no, you don't have to do that. There was a question today about casuals being asked to be on standby to deliver teaching. And yes, that's fine, and they need to be paid. But if you're going to have casuals on standby to do teaching and they get sick, then you need to pay them for that period of time that they're sick. So those are all specific circumstances that we can deal with. But in general, if you miss 2 weeks of teaching because you're sick, you don't have to catch it up, and you shouldn't try and catch it up because it won't be healthy. And remember, the fundamental principle here is that your health and safety is the most important thing. It's far more important than having a vibrant campus. It's far more important than who delivers a lecture or how it's delivered. It's far more important than whether the cafes are viable or not if you're not on campus, and that you have the right to enforce a health and safety workplace, a healthy and safe workplace. So we really encourage you to get involved and to do that. And Dom had a list of things you can do. The things that I would add to that is, if you don't know who your health and safety rep is, the first thing you do when you get off this session is find out who they are. If you don't seem to have one, then you might like to consider becoming one yourself and coming next Friday, or maybe bringing other members from your workplace or your work group to work out together who might like to become a health and safety rep. If you do know your health and safety rep, reach out to them, find out what's going on, ask them questions that they can then pass through to management, and generally engage with your health and safety reps. As we said, really key to this, really dedicated people who take health and safety really seriously, and they are your friend in this. So make sure you know who they are, and also provide them with support too. So that's the vast bulk of the questions by category. We can't answer them all individually, and I'm going to hand back to Ali, but I will answer any questions that go through to whs@nteu.org.au.
Great. Thanks, Gabe. Thanks, Gabe, and thanks, Dom, for those very interesting presentations. But thank you all for coming. It's really, I think, inspiring, and we all draw great strength from, I suppose, our collective and the strength in our numbers, and we've seen that today with so many of you showing up to today's meeting. I'm aware that there are questions that still need to be asked and answered. So as Gabe said, please get in contact with the union. That email address, if you missed it at the beginning, is whs@nteu.org.au. That's whs@nteu.org.au. Gabe concluded by saying the sorts of things that you can do, but one of the most important things you can do, if you're not a member, please consider joining. And if you are a member, talk to your workmates about joining the union, because we are always stronger. We're able much more effectively to fight for a stronger workplace with good workplace rights when we all stand together. So thank you so much for coming along today, and hopefully we will see you at next Friday's session when we look at the important work that HSRs do. Thank you all, and have a lovely weekend. Take care, everybody. Stay safe. Thanks.